A man who mistakes access for authority eventually learns that the locked door was never his to control. The VIP paddock at Harrington Speedway smelled of hot rubber, polished carbon fiber, expensive cologne, and champagne opened too early in the morning. Engines thundered behind the barriers like caged animals, while camera crews moved through the private entrance searching for faces rich enough to matter. Security staff in tailored black suits stood beside glass scanners, checking laminated passes that separated owners, sponsors, drivers, wives, mistresses, and everyone forced to pretend there was a difference. It was a beautiful place to be humiliated. Simone Albright arrived without hurry, dressed in quiet elegance, her posture so calm that even the noise seemed to bend around her. She wore no desperate jewelry, carried no wounded expression, and offered the world no performance of pain. Her beauty was not loud. It lived in the discipline of her stillness, in the way her eyes measured a room before anyone inside it understood they were being measured. She looked like restraint sharpened into form. Preston Crowe was already inside the velvet rope corridor, laughing beside Marissa Blythe as if the morning had been arranged for his amusement. His racing team's banners flew above the paddock, his guests filled the hospitality lounge, and his name sat printed across sponsor boards in letters large enough to feed his vanity. Marissa, blonde and gleaming, adjusted the VIP credential on her neck as photographers lifted their cameras, eager to catch the billionaire with the woman he had chosen to display. Preston enjoyed being watched. Simone reached the access scanner and placed her pass against the glass. For half a second, the small screen glowed blue beneath her fingers, reflecting her face back at her with surgical coldness. Then the machine blinked red, and the words appeared with brutal simplicity: access denied. The gate did not open. A security supervisor cleared his throat, suddenly aware that several sponsor wives had stopped talking. Somewhere beyond the barrier, a race engine screamed awake, drowning out the awkward silence for everyone except Simone. The supervisor looked at his tablet, then at her, then past her shoulder toward Preston, hoping the man who had caused the problem would rescue him from explaining it. He would not. Preston turned slowly, one hand resting at Marissa's lower back, his smile polished enough for cameras and cruel enough for marriage. "There must have been an update," he said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "This paddock is for people who still belong to my world." Marissa lowered her eyes and smiled. Simone did not flinch, because flinching would have given him proof that the wound had landed. She looked once at the red light, once at the gate, and finally at the husband who believed a scanner could measure her worth. Around them, the paddock continued its expensive rhythm. Carbon wheels rolling over painted concrete, mechanics speaking into encrypted radios, investors discussing sponsorship exposure over tiny cups of imported espresso, and phones vibrating with messages from lawyers who never attended events without a reason. Wealth always sounded busy before it collapsed. Preston waited for anger, for pleading, for some public fracture he could later describe as instability. Simone gave him nothing. She only removed her pass from the scanner, held it between two fingers as if it were a receipt for a purchase already regretted, and turned away from the entrance with the same graceful restraint she had carried into it. That silence frightened the smartest people watching. Preston mistook it for defeat, smiling as Marissa slipped through the open gate beside him. The cameras followed him, the guests resumed their conversations, and the engines roared toward the morning's first exhibition lap. No one saw Simone step into the shadow beside the service corridor and take out her phone. No one heard the message she sent to Lionel Fairborn, the legal director waiting in the team operations suite. It contained one word: proceed. By the time Preston reached the hospitality balcony, the paddock had already rearranged itself around his ego. Sponsors leaned toward him with practiced laughter, photographers caught his best angles, and Marissa stood beside him like a borrowed trophy polished for public use. The team colors flashed across digital walls behind them, making every glass surface reflect the same message: Preston Crowe belonged here. He needed the room to believe it. Below the balcony, mechanics moved with disciplined urgency around the race cars, their headsets buzzing with lap data, tire temperatures, and sponsor timing notes. Wealth in motorsport did not whisper through chandeliers or marble halls. It announced itself through telemetry screens, private pit suites, carbon fiber bodywork, and the quiet knowledge that one bad signature could cost more than a mansion. Preston loved the spectacle because spectacle forgave ignorance when the cameras were kind. Simone had understood the machinery beneath it. Years earlier, when Preston first entered racing, he bought attention before he understood consequence. He wanted the team because it made him look faster, younger, untouchable, and impossible to refuse. He liked the owner's jacket, the sponsored dinners, the helmet presentations, the way powerful men called him visionary after reading documents they had not written. Simone wrote the questions. She had sat through those early investment meetings with her hands folded, listening while bankers praised Preston's appetite for risk. She asked about voting thresholds, moral clauses, collateral triggers, sponsor default language, and whether operational control could shift if public misconduct damaged valuation. Preston had laughed afterward and told her she made every room feel like a deposition. He meant it as an insult. Simone had taken it as information. Their marriage had not broken in one dramatic night. It had been thinned slowly by his need to reduce her intelligence into coldness. When she corrected him, he called it criticism. When she protected him, he called it interference. When she remained quiet in rooms where he exaggerated his own genius, he mistook restraint for permission. That was his oldest mistake. Marissa entered the story at the exact point Preston began craving admiration without memory. She knew how to laugh at the right volume, how to touch his sleeve when cameras turned, how to ask simple questions that made him feel brilliant for answering. She did not need to understand the team because Preston preferred her that way. Ignorance, to him, was easier to decorate. From the balcony, Preston looked down toward the entrance where Simone had disappeared, and satisfaction warmed his face. She needed to learn boundaries, he said to a sponsor executive beside him. The executive gave a cautious smile, the kind men use when money is nearby but judgment has not yet chosen a side. Marissa tilted her head, letting the VIP pass swing against her white silk blouse. She looked so calm, she said, as if calmness were a defect. Preston laughed softly. That's what she does when she loses. He was wrong. In the operations corridor below, Simone walked past walls covered with race strategy screens and sponsor activation schedules. No one stopped her there. A junior coordinator saw her, straightened, and opened the frosted glass door to the legal suite without asking for a badge. Lionel Fairborn was already standing beside the conference table, a stack of acquisition documents arranged with almost ceremonial precision. Mrs. Albright, he said. Simone placed the rejected Paddock pass on the table. Begin. That was all. Lionel nodded once, and the machinery Preston had never bothered to understand started moving without him. Emails went out to the board. Access lists froze. Hospitality credentials entered review. Sponsor council received the control notice. In the balcony lounge, Preston raised a glass to cameras, still smiling inside the illusion he had built. Beneath him, the floor had already shifted. 3 years before that morning, Preston Crowe had nearly lost the team in a room with no cameras. The public never saw the debt schedule, the failed sponsorship bridge, the emergency refinancing calls, or the way his confidence thinned whenever bankers stopped praising him and began asking for collateral. He had entered that conference suite wearing a victory smile, but by the second hour, even his gold cufflinks looked nervous beneath the fluorescent calm of legal language. Money has a way of undressing arrogance. Simone sat 2 seats away from him, silent while the advisors explained restructuring options on a wall screen filled with ownership percentages, voting rights, default triggers, and sponsor morality clauses. Preston nodded as if he understood every line, though his eyes kept drifting toward the rendering of the new team hospitality suite, the one he had promised would make him look untouchable. He cared about the image of control, the branded glass, the private balcony, the owner's entrance, the kind of exclusivity that made weaker men call him sir. Simone cared about the clauses. When the lawyers discussed emergency capital, she asked who would hold protective voting rights if Preston breached governance covenants. When the bank proposed a personal guarantee tied to future sponsor revenues, she asked whether reputational damage could accelerate a control transfer. When the team council mentioned standard conduct language, she asked for the exact definition of public misuse of team assets. The room changed after that. Preston had smiled tightly, tapping one finger against the table as if her precision embarrassed him. You are turning a racing deal into a courtroom, he said, trying to make the bankers laugh. Simone looked at the term sheet, not at him. It already is. No one laughed then. The lead banker adjusted his glasses. The senior counsel stopped speaking in easy summaries and began reading from the document itself. Preston shifted in his chair, annoyed that his wife had forced the room to treat him like a man entering risk instead of a king receiving applause. He signed anyway. He signed because the alternative was admitting the team was bleeding money beneath the shine. He signed because sponsors were waiting, journalists were circling, and his pride could not survive a delayed season launch. She had not argued with him in the car afterward when he accused her of humiliating him. Each small abuse created a record. Each record created a pattern. Each pattern waited for the day he would be careless enough to perform cruelty in front of witnesses. That day had arrived. In the legal suite beneath the track, Lionel Fairborn opened the same restructuring file Preston had once mocked and placed the active control notice beside Simone's rejected pass. The public conduct trigger is clean, he said. Multiple witnesses, credential misuse, sponsor exposure, and unauthorized reassignment of access privileges. Simone read the first page, then slid it back. File it. Lionel pressed send. Above them, Preston's name still glowed on the hospitality screens, but the system behind those screens had begun removing him one permission at a time. Preston spent the next 20 minutes turning his mistake into theater. He moved Marissa through the hospitality suite as if every doorway existed to prove she had replaced someone important, introducing her to sponsors, team guests, and executives with the careless warmth of a man spending money he did not know was already gone. She laughed when he laughed, touched his arm when cameras lifted, and stood beside the glass railing above pit lane as if proximity to speed could make borrowed status permanent. She wore his arrogance well. Below them, the team prepared for the morning exhibition lap with mechanical discipline. Tire blankets came off in waves of heat. Mechanics checked wheel guns under the sharp buzz of headsets, and engineers watched telemetry streams move across blue-lit monitors like a second nervous system. The whole operation looked like Preston's kingdom only to people who confused branding with control. The people who signed invoices knew better. Preston leaned close to a sponsor chairman from Denver and spoke about expansion, global visibility, and a new luxury partnership built around younger energy. He did not say Simone's name, but he shaped the room around her absence. Every smile, every toast, every glance toward Marissa was designed to make the same announcement without the courage of a direct sentence. He wanted exile to look elegant. At the far end of the suite, a communications director received the first internal notice and stopped mid-conversation. Her eyes moved once across the screen, then toward the legal corridor below. She did not react loudly, because trained professionals in wealthy rooms know panic travels faster than truth. She excused herself quietly and walked away with her phone already pressed to her ear. The first crack made no sound. Preston noticed nothing. He was too busy standing beneath a digital wall that still carried his name, speaking into a cluster of microphones about loyalty, leadership, and the future of the team. Marissa stood slightly behind him, smiling at the cameras with the polished confidence of someone who believed a VIP credential was proof of arrival. When a reporter asked whether Simone would be joining the event later, Preston gave the smallest theatrical pause. Some people choose not to attend moments they can no longer influence, he said. The line landed exactly where he wanted it to land. A few guests laughed softly. A few did not. Near the team operations suite, Lionel Fairborn received confirmation from sponsor council, then from the board administrator, then from the outside governance firm. Each message was short, precise, and fatal to Preston's illusion. Control notice accepted. Access authority transferred. Public communications paused pending updated ownership statement. Lionel read them without satisfaction. Law did not need emotion to be devastating. Simone stood beside the frosted glass wall, watching pit lane through the narrow vertical window. She could see the mechanics working, the drivers waiting, the cameras searching for spectacle, and Preston above them performing ownership like a costume. She did not ask whether the room had turned against him yet. She knew systems moved slowly until they moved all at once. Then a junior coordinator entered, pale but composed, and said the hospitality team was requesting instruction because Mr. Crow had begun the sponsor presentation early. Lionel looked at Simone. Do we interrupt now? Simone turned from the window. Let him finish. It was not mercy. It was evidence. Upstairs, Preston lifted his glass and thanked the room for believing in his vision. Behind the service doors, the access database refreshed. Marissa's temporary credential changed first, then Preston's private garage clearance, then his authority over the VIP list. On the digital wall behind him, the team logo flickered for half a second, so briefly only the communications director noticed. She lowered her eyes. The fall had begun while he was still applauding himself. The applause faded before Preston noticed the silence that followed it. In wealthy rooms, approval usually lingered in small gestures. A sponsor leaning closer, a lawyer nodding from the wall, a communications aide stepping forward with the next cue. This time, no one moved quickly enough to protect him from the pause. Beyond the glass, a wheel gun screamed in the garage, and silence entered the room wearing a legal badge. Lionel Fairborn appeared at the hospitality entrance with two members of team administration behind him, each carrying a tablet instead of a smile. He did not raise his voice, did not rush, and did not look at Marissa as if she mattered to the issue in front of him. His dark suit was severe, his expression almost kind in the way precise. Men become kind when the facts are already fatal. Preston hated him immediately. Lionel, Preston said, setting his glass down with too much force. This is a sponsor presentation. Lionel inclined his head once. It was. The correction landed without decoration. Marissa's smile tightened as the sponsor chairman from Denver took half a step away from Preston, pretending to study the track below. Around the balcony, conversations died in layers, first among the executives, then among the guests, then among the people who did not understand the problem but understood the posture of those who did. Money has its own weather. Preston walked toward Lionel with the practiced irritation of a man used to having doors opened before he touched them. Whatever document you have, it can wait until after the launch, he said. My team is about to go live. Lionel opened the slim tablet in his hand and looked at the screen, not at Preston's pride. Operational control has changed. The room heard it. Preston smiled, because smiling was the last tool arrogance reached for before confusion. Changed by whom? He asked. The question was meant to humiliate Lionel, but it only invited the answer. Lionel stepped aside. Simone entered through the service corridor in quiet burgundy elegance, neither hurried nor dramatic, her rejected pass no longer in her hand. She did not look like a woman returning to beg for entry. She looked like someone arriving to inspect property. The sponsor chairman straightened. The communications director lowered her phone. Even the mechanics visible through the glass seemed suddenly closer to stillness. Preston's face hardened when he saw her. You're not authorized to be in here. Simone looked at him for the first time since the gate. I am. 2 words. Nothing more. Lionel placed the control notice on the nearest high table, turning it so Preston could see the verified signatures and timestamp. He explained that the board administrator had accepted the governance trigger, sponsor council had confirmed reputational breach exposure, and the protective voting rights had moved under the controlling investment vehicle now represented by Simone Albright. He spoke in clean sentences, each one more humiliating because none of them sounded personal. Law did not need to hate Preston. It only needed to recognize him. Preston snatched the document, scanned the first page, then the second, his eyes moving faster as comprehension began to cut through vanity. This is temporary, he said. A technical hold. Lionel folded his hands in front of him. No, the sponsor chairman said nothing, but his silence moved fully to Simone's side. Marissa looked between Preston and the paper, finally realizing the man beside her had given her access to a room he no longer controlled. Her hand drifted toward the VIP pass at her neck. It suddenly looked cheap. Preston turned on Simone. You planned this. Simone held his stare with perfect calm. You signed it. That ended the sentence before it could become an argument. Around them, phones began vibrating as updated access instructions reached every department. The hospitality screens behind Preston flickered again, then refreshed into a neutral holding graphic with no personal name attached. His face disappeared from the event schedule. His welcome remarks vanished from the internal program. The private owner's suite shifted to restricted status under new authorization. Preston stared at the wall as if the pixels had betrayed him, but they had only obeyed. Lionel looked toward security and gave a small nod. No one touched Preston. No one needed to. The room had already stepped away from him. Preston stared at the neutral holding graphic as if the screen had committed treason. A few minutes earlier, it had displayed his name in polished silver letters above the team logo, large enough for every sponsor, reporter, and guest to understand who was supposed to be worshipped. Now the wall showed only the official racing emblem, the next session time, and a short notice that all public statements were pending confirmation from controlling ownership. His throne had become a schedule. Lionel Fairborn did not rush the room through the truth. He let the silence settle first, because men like Preston often needed witnesses more than explanations. The sponsor chairman stood with his hands clasped behind his back. The communications director waited beside the glass doors, and Marissa remained frozen near the balcony railing with one hand still touching the useless credential at her throat. Everyone understood enough. Preston lowered the document, his face pale beneath the expensive confidence he was trying to hold together. Controlling ownership, he repeated, turning the phrase into an accusation. Through what vehicle? Lionel answered before Simone had to. Albright Meridian Holdings. The name moved through the room like a blade drawn slowly from silk. A senior sponsor counsel who had been silent until then looked down at his phone, confirmed something, and gave the faintest nod toward Simone. Preston saw it and hated him for it. Betrayal feels different when it is only professionalism. That entity was a passive investor, Preston said, forcing a laugh that did not survive the sentence. Minority exposure. No operational authority. Lionel tapped the second page of the notice. Until the conduct trigger. Preston's jaw tightened. He looked at Simone as if anger could drag her back into the smaller role he had built for her in public. You used my own team against me. Simone did not blink. Your conduct did. The sentence was short enough to be mercy and sharp enough to leave a mark. Around them, the mechanics on the pit monitors began preparing the lead car for its first exhibition lap, unaware that the ownership crisis above them had already decided the future of their employment. Simone turned from Preston and addressed the team principal, a tired man with silver hair and oil-darkened fingers despite his tailored jacket. She asked whether the crew had everything necessary to complete the morning session. Not whether Preston approved. Not whether Marissa was embarrassed. Not whether the cameras had captured enough humiliation. The work came first. The team principal straightened. Yes, Mrs. Albright. Preston flinched at the title because the respect in it had not been requested. Marissa finally stepped closer to him, whispering that perhaps they should go somewhere private, but even that sounded less like loyalty than self-preservation. She had entered the paddock as proof of replacement and discovered she was standing beside a man being replaced. Luxury turns cold when the borrowed key stops opening doors. Lionel continued with the formal consequences. Preston's authority over hospitality access was suspended. His private garage credential was revoked pending board review. His media appearance was canceled. Any attempt to represent himself as controlling owner would be treated as a governance violation and sponsor breach. Each sentence removed another costume. Preston looked toward the sponsor chairman, waiting for rescue from someone who had praised him at dinners, accepted his invitations, and once called him essential to the team's future. The chairman avoided the trap of sentiment. Our contract follows control, he said quietly. That was the moment Preston truly understood the crowd had moved. No one lunged at him. No one shouted him down. They simply stopped attaching their safety to his name. Simone watched it happen without pleasure, because pleasure would have made the victory smaller. Preston leaned toward her, lowering his voice as if intimacy could still command obedience. You think this makes you powerful? Simone looked past him toward the cars waiting below. It makes the team safe. The room absorbed the difference. Preston had expected revenge to look like rage, accusation, public ruin, a wife begging the world to believe her pain. Simone gave him none of that. She gave him process. She gave him continuity. She gave the team a future without his vanity. That was the wound. On the screen behind them, the holding notice changed again. A new line appeared beneath the team emblem. Executive control confirmed. Simone Albright. Preston saw her name where his had been and had no sentence left strong enough to erase it. Preston's first instinct was to walk somewhere the room would be forced to follow. He turned from the screen with a sharpness meant to restore hierarchy, crossed the hospitality suite, and headed toward the private garage corridor where his name had once opened every door before his hand reached the glass. A billionaire deprived of attention often searches for architecture that still remembers him. The corridor did not. Behind him, Marissa hesitated half a second too long before following, and that delay said more than any confession could have. Sponsors watched from the balcony with careful faces, pretending not to witness a man chase a privilege that had already left his possession. Lionel Fairborn remained beside Simone, carrying no triumph in his expression, only the quiet patience of a man waiting for procedure to finish its work. Procedure was cruel enough. Preston reached the first security point and pressed his credential against the scanner. The small panel flashed blue, paused, then turned red with a dry electronic beep that cut through the hallway more sharply than shouting could have. Access revoked. The words sat on the screen without apology. Preston pressed the card again, harder, as if pressure could revive ownership. The scanner repeated the verdict. A young security attendant swallowed, keeping both hands visible, his face pale with the terror of having to deny a man who used to terrify other people. "Sir, I'm unable to open this access point." Preston turned on him. "Do you know who I am?" The question sounded old the moment it left his mouth. From several steps behind, Simone watched without expression. Marissa lifted her own pass, desperate to prove that at least one part of the morning still belonged to her, and touched it against the scanner with a brittle smile. Red. Access revoked. Her hand fell slowly, the plastic card swinging from its silk lanyard like a price tag after the sale had ended. Borrowed status has no dignity when the lender goes bankrupt. Preston looked back toward the suite, expecting someone important to intervene. No one did. The sponsor chairman had turned away to speak with counsel. The communications director was already rewriting the press sequence. The team principal was on his radio, confirming that garage operations should continue under revised authority without disruption. Life was moving around Preston, not through him. He pushed toward the second door, the one leading to the owner's viewing bay above the garage floor. Another scanner. Another red light. Another refusal, colder than the last because witnesses had multiplied. Lionel stepped forward just enough to be heard. "Mr. Crow, your garage clearance is suspended pending review." Preston's laugh cracked at the edge. "You can't suspend me from my own garage." Simone finally spoke. "Not yours." Two words closed the argument. The team principal looked down, not from shame, but to avoid giving Preston the fight he wanted. Mechanics passed behind the glass with tires, data tablets, and torque wrenches, continuing the work that did not require Preston's approval. The lead car rolled on its stands beneath white overhead lights, beautiful and indifferent, its polished body reflecting people who still had duties. It no longer reflected him as owner. Preston's face tightened with something near disbelief, but uglier, because disbelief still contains innocence. "I funded this," he said. Lionel answered calmly. "You leveraged it." The distinction landed heavily. Simone did not add anything. She did not remind him of the loans, the guarantees, the clauses, the warnings he mocked, or the signatures he gave away with a pen and a smile. Facts lose force when repeated for men who once refused to read them. Instead, she moved past him toward the garage entrance. The scanner turned green before her card touched the glass completely. The door opened. Staff inside straightened, not theatrically, but with the instinctive respect people show when chaos has been replaced by command. Preston stood inches away, close enough to smell the warm rubber and racing fuel beyond the threshold, close enough to hear the pit crew calling final checks, close enough to see the world he had used as a stage continue without him. That was the punishment. Simone stepped inside, paused only once, and looked back at Lionel. "Continue operations." Then the door closed between Preston and the garage, sealing him outside with Marissa, the dead credentials, and the hollow echo of a man who had mistaken permission for possession. The garage door closed with a soft hydraulic hush, and the sound damaged Preston more than a slammed door ever could. A slam would have given him drama, a visible wound, something to point at later when he needed to call himself betrayed. This was worse because it was clean, procedural, and final. The building had simply stopped recognizing him. For several seconds, he stood in the corridor with Marissa beside him and two dead credentials hanging between them like evidence. Through the glass, the pit crew continued working beneath white technical lights, tightening wheels, checking tire pressure, and speaking in clipped radio codes that had nothing to do with his mood. The team did not collapse without him. That was the insult. Marissa touched his sleeve, but the gesture had lost its camera-ready elegance. "Preston," she whispered, "maybe we should leave before people start filming." It was the first honest thing she had said all morning, though honesty had arrived too late to be useful. He pulled his arm away, not violently, just sharply enough to remind her that humiliation always looks for a smaller place to land. She lowered her hand and glanced toward the hospitality balcony, where former admirers now looked busy enough to avoid loyalty. A borrowed crown becomes heavy when the room sees the receipt. Down on the track, the first car fired its engine. The deep mechanical roar rolled through the building, vibrating in the glass and concrete, carrying the smell of fuel, hot tires, and polished metal into the corridor. It should have sounded like triumph to Preston. Instead, it sounded like something leaving without him. Lionel Fairborn stepped toward the original Paddock entrance, speaking quietly into his phone as he coordinated the public update. Yes, revised ownership language. No personal commentary. Confirm sponsor continuity. Use controlling principle. Every word was a nail placed neatly into the old version of Preston's life. Preston heard enough to move. He walked fast toward the VIP Paddock gate, the same entrance where he had made Simone stand outside while cameras waited for weakness. Marissa followed, slower now, her eyes moving across faces that no longer admired her access. Guests parted without touching them. No one wanted to be photographed too close to a falling man. The Paddock entrance came into view, bright with morning glare and guarded by the same glass scanner. Earlier, Preston had stood on the safe side of that threshold, smiling while Simone's pass turned red. Now he approached from inside, trying to leave through authority and re-enter through denial. The same scanner waited for him. He pressed his card against the scanner. Red. Access revoked. He tried again. Red. The security supervisor who had been forced to deny Simone now stood straighter, his fear replaced by policy. Mr. Crow, I have instructions not to grant Paddock re-entry. Preston's face darkened. From my wife. The supervisor did not answer quickly enough, because the truth itself had become dangerous. Simone appeared behind the glass doors from the garage corridor, walking beside the team principal and Lionel, her expression unchanged. The scanner turned green for her before anyone spoke. The gate opened. Preston looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing for the first time that her calm had never been absence, never been surrender, never been emptiness. It had been control without performance. When did you do this? He asked, and the question came out smaller than he intended. Simone stopped beside him, close enough for him to hear her without the room hearing too much. Before today, he swallowed, trying to find accusation inside timing. You let me humiliate myself. Her eyes stayed steady. You chose witnesses. The words cut cleaner than anger. Lionel handed a final notice to the security supervisor, who updated the access roster on his tablet. Marissa's credential disappeared from the guest list. Preston saw it happen, saw her name vanish because his permission could no longer protect it. She stepped back from him as if distance might save her from sharing the fall. Simone moved through the open gate, and every person near the entrance understood the reversal without needing an announcement. The woman locked outside now entered without resistance. The man who had mocked her now stood before the same red light. Preston tried one last time to speak with the authority of the morning's version of himself. I built this world. Simone paused, not turning fully. You rented the spotlight. Then she looked once toward the team garage, where engines waited under her command. I own the structure. She walked on. The gate closed behind her with the same soft hydraulic hush, leaving Preston on the wrong side of the glass with the cameras, the dead pass, and the silence he had planned for someone else. By late afternoon, the raceway had stopped pretending the change was temporary. The hospitality suite no longer carried Preston's name. The timing monitors no longer held his media slot, and the private garage access list had been rebuilt around engineers, drivers, mechanics, sponsor council, and people who actually served the team. The air smelled of hot brakes, cooling fuel, tire blankets, and polished concrete as headsets crackled with instructions that no longer required Preston's approval. Quiet ownership had outlasted loud entitlement. Preston remained near the outer corridor, stripped of the soft protections that had followed him for years. Assistants who anticipated his anger, executives who translated his mistakes into strategy, guests who smiled because his table was expensive. Marissa had already disappeared into a waiting car, leaving behind the lanyard she had worn like a crown that morning. It lay in a security tray beside Preston's revoked pass, two pieces of plastic proving how cheaply access could be dressed up as power. The team moved on. Inside the garage, Simone stood beside the team principal while engineers reviewed the next race strategy. She did not fire people for having obeyed old instructions, and she did not punish staff for Preston's arrogance. She removed only the privileges that had turned the organization into one man's vanity stage: personal guest overrides, unauthorized companion credentials, private sponsor introductions, and any access not tied to actual team function. Her revenge was not destruction. It was governance. When the lead car returned from its final run, the pit crew gathered for a brief operational meeting beneath the white lights. Simone thanked the crew for staying professional, then gave one instruction: the team would never again be used as a private stage. No speech, no tears, no performance, just a new standard. Preston found her near the pit lane exit as sunset lowered over the track, turning the glass barriers gold and the empty grandstands gray. He looked smaller without an audience, older without applause, and angrier because the world had not stopped to mourn his removal. He stepped into her path, trying one last time to recover the shape of command. "You think buying a team makes you more than my wife?" Simone stopped. Around them, the pit lane had gone quiet except for distant tools being packed away and the low hum of service vehicles crossing the far end of the track. Lionel stood several steps behind her, close enough to intervene, wise enough not to interrupt. Preston's voice softened into accusation, the last disguise of a man with no leverage left. "After everything I gave you, this is what you do." Simone looked at him with a calm so complete it left him nowhere to place his rage. "You gave me a locked gate," she said. "I took back the ownership behind it." The sentence needed no volume because the documents had already done the damage. Preston's face changed slowly, not from shock, but from recognition. For the first time, he understood she had not taken his world. She had only removed his illusion from it. He had mistaken her silence for weakness, her restraint for dependence, and her dignity for permission to humiliate her. Every assumption had signed its own defeat. Simone walked past him toward the waiting exit, her steps steady, her expression untouched by the wreckage behind her. No camera caught a dramatic smile. No crowd applauded her departure. The victory was colder, cleaner, and more permanent than that. Behind her, Preston stood alone beside the pit lane, close enough to hear the last engine cooling in the garage, far enough from power to finally understand what he had lost. The gate opened for Simone without hesitation. She did not look back. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.